I noticed something very interesting. So we have this massive buildup. This is actually probably an understatement now because it keeps changing. We had those drills that Iran held, but now there's joint drills being held by China and Russia and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz, in and around the Strait of Hormuz. These are annual drills, Will for Peace 2026. They've been happening every year since 2018. And what's interesting about this, Charmine, is if we go by what Axios has said about when a war will launch, they have said that the timeline could be shorter than weeks away, which means, Charmine, that if a war begins, the United States launches a war, Russia and China will be sailing their naval carriers and destroyers and whatnot that are participating in these drills while this is happening.
Trump says a lot of things, the actions where it's at. Actions also can change from week to week. I mean, expect the unexpected, and all our ability to rationally, parse through the information and come up with likely scenarios has gone out the window, right? We don't know the level of cooperation between Russia, China, and Iran. Only in the few things like these drills, et cetera, that they announce. And we're not going to know. And there's good reason for that. You don't let your enemy. I never understand how the Americans just nonstop talk in the lead up to war. They provide so much information for their enemy, and maybe it hasn't mattered in the past because they haven't been fighting peer allies. But I would argue that Iran is a peer ally at this point in terms of its missile arsenal. Doesn't have to be a peer ally in every area, right? But in terms of its missile arsenal, Iran has become a peer ally of most of NATO. So these three countries, are giving a signal. But as I alluded to earlier, the naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz, which was announced by Nikolai Patrushev, who's Putin's advisor and former head of Russia's Security Council, who is, by the way, people think Putin's hardline. Putin's considered a moderate in Russia. Patrushev is, oh my God, you have to read about this guy if y'all don't know. I posted an interview on my blog years ago. This guy was going to the heart of things like I had not seen anyone do. So a really remarkable fellow. He's now an advisor to Putin. And he said that these drills are part of expanded BRICS coordination. Okay, BRICS is more of an economics organization, right? These particular drills are called the Maritime Security Belt of 2026. This is new language. All right. So in a recent interview, Patrushev gave to, I think it was a Russian publication, newspaper, he said that raids on Russian vessels and cargoes in the world ocean, this is language you're going to be seeing more and more, will become more frequent because the West seeks to disrupt Russia's foreign trade. The Russians are saying that the sea is becoming a springboard for aggression, and the West is now reviving and engaging in gunboat diplomacy. Patrushev and others suspect that the next step is, if these acts of piracy, as the Russians call it, meaning like stopping or onboarding sanctioned vessels, what the Americans are saying are like dangerous vessels taking contraband and oil, God forbid, that are not allowed to. I mean, these are unilateral U.S. rulings, right, that other countries like India feel like they're pressed to uphold. So if the West's piracy is not stopped, the West is going to embolden then to try to block Russian access to the Atlantic, okay, and just take out Russian trade as much as possible. So Patrushev is saying that the Russians need a formidable new navy to stop this piracy and the development of a high-tech fleet. As we know, the Russians, like the Chinese and the Iranians, when they make a decision like that, they're done very quickly. So now the Moscow is talking about building a multipolar world order in this world ocean, a key objective that it expects the BRICS to also implement. Okay, and when I hear the Russians saying that, I feel like it's a hint to India, especially in light of India's, boarding of vessels very recently in this week, and that the BRICS needs to create a full-fledged strategic maritime dimension. So there's a reason this one's called Maritime Security Belt. It's not just to warn off the Americans, but it's to warn a lot of players that these three countries who have full freedom of navigation in any waterway anywhere, and because the Americans have done it, they just have to, they don't need to, they just have to recreate the wheel. I heard this from a very close to the IRGC think tank in Iran years ago. We don't even have to, the Americans go into all waters now, claiming counterterrorism, claiming piracy reasons, etc. So now we just go into all waters now. The Iranians go into, naval vessels go into the Indian Ocean and far beyond, because who can say no? We're also countering terrorism. We're also countering piracy. These three countries are also sending a signal in these exercises that we are going to create a new paradigm for the world oceans, and we expect our partners in BRICS and other institutions to comply. Otherwise, we're all going to have our trade routes cut off.
So in this article in the Tehran Times, they cite Petrushev, and he says straight up that we will tap into the potential of BRICS, which should now be given a full-fledged strategic maritime dimension. And that is, that's new language. Generally, BRICS has stayed on the level of economic cooperation and developing payments,
creating platforms,
payments, payment systems, cooperation around financing. This is different. This is the first time I've heard, because these are not new exercises, but it's the first time I've heard anyone from those three countries use the words BRICS alongside maritime strategic direction.
Which is good, because it tells us that they're paying attention. Like I said, we don't get a lot of sound bites from these governments, these three countries. So it's hard for us to figure out, do they understand what's going on? Are they even aware? But something else maybe worth mentioning here in passing is I think these countries are also expecting like mass terror operations by the West. The way China sort of like globbed onto the Mossad operations in Iran, and how foreign actors turned these riots, peaceful protests in Iran into, murderous riots, right? Where hundreds of security officials were killed, most of them unarmed. Things were burnt down, from banks to buses, things that civilians use, right? The reason China sort of globbed onto that and wanted to understand the intricacies, and likely working with Iran to do that, is because it expects that kind of thing on its own territory. I don't know what you think of the Uyghur situation, but China was experiencing terrorism in its cities until it, in the 2000s, it started these re-education camps. And, when I went to China last fall, it was my first time there ever. I didn't go to Beijing. I've heard that you will see security forces in Beijing in key areas, but you will not see them in any other Chinese cities. They've done a great job in wiping out terrorism, but I think that's going to come back with a vengeance. The Ukrainians have already sort of like paved the road for that. Russia expects these kind of activities. Nord Stream, the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. I mean, please, a Ukrainian, boat did it. It's insane. This is a Western government operation at the highest levels. Very likely multiple governments. The Russians have constantly fingered the British. It's not somewhere we see, blamed in sort of English language media, but the British comes up regularly in Moscow's discourse. But, there was the Druzhba pipeline. I don't know if your viewers have heard about this, but it was Hungary's, so the reasons come out in the news again. Hungary just came out this week and said Ukraine is obstructing the Druzhba pipeline from delivering Russian oil. Druzhba means friendship in Russian. It says, the Hungarians said the attacks on or around the pipeline did not damage it. Ukraine can allow Russian oil to flow, but it won't. Then Slovakia jumped in and said, yes, Ukraine is basically operating political blackmail. The pipeline is one of the world's longest, okay, I think something like over 4,000 kilometers. It goes from Russia to points in Ukraine, Belarus, Hungary, I think also Poland, Slovakia, all the way to Germany. But then remember, in 2023, Pentagon documents leaked, there was a note of a conversation between Zelensky and his deputy in which he suggests blowing up the Druzhba pipeline to hit Hungary's industry, hit Hungary for not cooperating with the rest of the EU on like sanctions on Russia, et cetera, right? And so the pipeline was struck several times in 2025. That's what they're going to do. That's what the West is going to do. That's what Trump's new sort of rejigging of the world order is going to get us to, essentially. But here's the thing, and here's my question. Will now Russia, China, Iran, and others do that back? Because they're not going to learn unless you do it back to them. How do you think Hezbollah managed for 18 years, okay, a much smaller country, a non-state actor in a state, where its position in the state is contested, versus Israel, the most qualitatively and the most advanced military, in this region. How do you think Hezbollah managed to keep the Israelis at bay for 18 years? Deterrence. All right. They would strike selectively to send messages to the Israeli military. If you do this, we can do that. Do you want to go there? Do you? So I think I'm very worried about infrastructure. And don't forget China's BRI, right? And Russia, Iran, India's INSTIC, the International North-South Transportation Corridor, and the myriad other pipelines and corridors that have emerged from this big push to develop more routes, land routes, land pipelines, land railroads, as well as port systems. These are going to be hit. Economic warfare. I mean, we've seen so much of it. We've seen it in Venezuela, we've seen in Yemen, we've seen in Cuba now, right? Absolutely besiege a country, starve them out. This has become run of the mill. And to think that they will not take out all our infrastructure to starve our people is, you've got another thing coming. And, maybe the only way to stop them is to hit them back. I really, this is rule of the jungle, and guess who's pushing it? It is the Americans who have benefited more from the post-World War II global order than any other country on earth is now shattering it. And, Danny, I sent you, when we first started chatting, the Munich Security Conference's report, right. Which is kind of crazy. I mean, if you read it, it's, I have to remember, I think the title of it is, just for viewers to know, is Under Destruction. So, and in it, they basically, so this is Europe, okay? Europe's security apparatus basically saying, and I quote, "The world has entered a period of wrecking ball politics. Sweeping destruction rather than careful reforms and policy corrections is the order of the day. The most prominent of those who promise to free their country from the existing order's constraints and rebuild a stronger, more prosperous nation is the current U.S. administration. As a result, more than 80 years after construction begun, the U.S.-led post-1945 international order is now under destruction." They consistently name Trump as the leader of the destruction, the era of destruction. They called Trump and his cronies, meaning also political parties that like Trump in Europe, as demolition men, and it's a great read, by the way. Munich Security Report, okay, that just came out in February. And the European nations have to now find another way to not be disposed of, to be relevant. Because, they're saying the Americans, Trump administration is trying to kick out liberalism once and for all. But liberalism is kind of how Trump's coterie have fared, the billionaire class, how they've done well, right? Liberalism has ushered in an era of billionaire-run governments, right, throughout the Western Hemisphere. So I'm not sure. I mean, the Europeans really, really don't understand how bad their situation is. And they're worried, and they say this in the report, that we're worried that what Trump is doing now is ushering in a period of the US, Russia, and China establishing spheres of influence, which really leaves no place for Europe. And they're saying that we, in order to destroy the destroyers, we have to be as bold as the actors doing this destroying. I don't see Europe going that way. I see Europe being sidelined. But then, of course, they talk about Trump and these people, the demolition man, bringing in a culture war and resurrecting a supposed pre-feminist white Christian past, which takes us right to Marco Rubio's speech at the Munich Security Conference. And this all plays into whether there's going to be a war or not. I mean, it's really worth discussing, because what I'm seeing basically is that what the Americans are saying and doing, what the Europeans are saying and doing, is giving us some brand new geopolitical information. Okay, we cannot ignore this. This is how they're seeing things, and they're going to move forward on the basis of these observations and these statements of theirs. We should be paying close attention to this. So, on one hand, the Europeans, are derisive about how the Americans are operating. On the other hand, they're not condemning U.S. attacks on nuclear facilities in Iran, right? Neither are their institutions, not the IAEA. They're not allowed to do so at the UN Security Council. The Europeans seemed fine with the U.S. kidnapping of a sitting president in Venezuela. They seem fine with the economic blockade of Cuba. You can't have your cake and eat it too. I think Europe's in a very bad place, and it won't recover soon enough to help the Americans along with their agenda. So the Americans, in my view, and we've had some hints of this, about the U.S. talking about regime changing European countries, and that will be interesting. That's the end of the Atlantic Alliance, or if they can. Listen, Danny, what if they get in? What if the Trump regime changes, the UK, France, and Germany, arguably their most important European partners, and gets in right-wing, anti-immigrant, whatever, let's destroy the world type people? Where's the money going to come from to do this? The fact is, the only thing the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and their allies in the multipolar world need to do is disrupt trade in Western currencies, and particularly the US dollar. Then there's no money for them to go forth on this path of global destruction and demolition.
There was a piece in the Cradle that you mentioned about how China is moving to help Iran contain Mossad inside of the country. And you mentioned, I've been to Xinjiang a couple of times, and I've even been in Urumqi. They have a whole expo for actually new security forces to look at what happened during that period between 1990 and 2016, where hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese people were killed by so-called Uyghur separatists who were actually being trained on the border regions outside of the country. And so there's a lot of sensitivity to this, and a lot of emphasis on it, both on border policy and on just general security in that part of the country, to keep that from coming back, to keep it away. And so the point I wanted to ask you about, though, is what exactly was covered in this piece? Because I've also been hearing about cooperation between Iran and China on this area, and it is one that, given the way that Israel and the U.S. like to wage war now, or maybe how they've always liked to wage war since the U.S. became hegemon in 1945, is to create this incredible internal disruption, chaos, division, and dissension, so that whatever they do kinetically can be that much more effective, or even just effective at all.
Well, I mean, we've seen through these wars, the Israeli one and the U.S. ones and the foreign-backed ones inside Iran, etc. A great deal of technology and intelligence penetration that has been made possible by technology, right? Let's just call it intelligence warfare, but heavily dependent on technology. And the Chinese have noticed that this kind of intelligence warfare now precedes kinetic military engagement. What we've seen from the Israelis and the Americans is due an internal shock and awe, right? Decapitation of maybe organizations or leaders. And then you think you can sort of like run free after that, right? That isn't always the case. That wasn't the case in Lebanon. The Lebanese special forces, the Hezbollah special forces, were on the front lines, stopping any Israeli troop encroachment into Lebanon after the pager attacks, etc. After the killing of Hezbollah Secretary General. Iran didn't stop. I think there was like maybe 12 hours before they had their, new people assigned to these roles and things moving. The Chinese want to learn from this. At least this is what our author, who is a China specialist and a China-Israel relations specialist based in Egypt, has written. So I think that's a really important point. Seeing the system of development of warfare, that it always seems to now be preceded, right? I said the blueprint for the Europeans, for the Americans, for the Israelis, that alliance is now one and the same. So they're noticing those patterns. They also, are watching or examining things like the structural weaknesses. So there's technological gaps for a country like Iran, right? So China can help fill those technological gaps, maybe the Russians, maybe other allies even. But they are digging deeper. What are the structural weaknesses? How were any Iranian facilities penetrated through technology and intelligence means? When you get that information, because the blueprint is the same, or the playbook is the same, you can be far more prepared. China can be far more prepared internally. Russia can be far more prepared internally. At almost every level, the Americans are pushing together these three Eurasian powers to cooperate more and more. What aren't they cooperating now? I mean, we just had yesterday, the Russian minister of, I can't remember what, went and signed a whole bunch of deals with Iran. Guess what? Infrastructure. The Russians developing Iranians' gas fields, like next level, right? It's just pushing us closer and closer together. I don't know. I mean, I advise everyone who's watching this to read the article. There's not a lot of facts in China about this kind of thing. We're just not going to know. But the author, who, like I said, is a China expert, did look at Chinese literature in regards to what was happening in Iran to piece together a story of how interested the Chinese have been in getting knee-deep in what happened in Iran and how foreign actors were able to do this to help Iran prepare for, a future breaches of security, and also China.
The big story to me appears to be, with all of this too, whether it's from the naval drills to this kind of cooperation with Iran, is, you mentioned before, infrastructure. China, it of course does not want to see its allies be, taking a beating and being overthrown, being destroyed by war. But there's another side of this too, where it's the reason why these countries are allies with China is because they are willing to do some of the deepest cooperation. Iran has been called the key to West Asia and Europe, and if Iran falls, then a lot of China's Belt and Road Initiative is actually in danger. And it has been in danger for quite some time. I mean, we know that a lot of these proxy forces, the Baluchi armed forces, all of them, they tend to go after, in Pakistan, for example, they go after Belt and Road projects. They blow them up. They commit terror attacks on them, and that also affects Chinese people, because Chinese people do have to go to these countries, do the advising, do the training, equipping, and the labor.
Yeah, but there's evidence that even the Israelis have seen that some of their actions have created reactions that were not just unforeseen, but are very, very dangerous for Israel. Who was it? I think it was Bennett who was talking about this recently. He was talking about how Naftali Bennett, the former PM of Israel, he was saying how, I remember, that in fact we might see an Arab NATO converge, right? The Israelis and Americans always pushed the idea of an Arab NATO that would work with Israel, right? To basically combat Iran's influence in the region, right? But Bennett was saying there could in fact emerge an Arab NATO with nuclear Pakistan at its, at its center. And this would be very bad for us. Oh, and under the auspices, like led by Turkey's new aversion to Israel, because Turkey is opportunistic. It swings both ways with Israel. But currently, Turkey's new aversion to Israel, which would make a Turkish Arab Pakistani configuration that will not have Iran in its sights, but will have Israel in its sights. And this is very real. And this kind of became possible because of the UAE and Israel, their close relationship, showing their hands one after another. The UAE basically took over swaths of the south of Yemen, went into Hadramaut. Like, it was the first major kinetic military operation of that scale that happened since the sort of, unannounced ceasefire in Yemen some years back. They went in and they took over the south of Yemen. The Saudis really woke up at that. And then shortly thereafter, the Israelis declared their recognition of Somaliland, right? A breakaway state that is recognized by no other countries in the world. And guess what? Somaliland lies right across from the southern shores of Yemen, okay, and is where the the Bab el-Mandab is, okay? This is a choke point, which could stop the Saudis from moving their ships, their trade through the Suez Canal. A map would be good for something like this, but maybe you can stick one up later. I can send you one now if you like.
Yeah, sure.
And this kind of the Israeli Emirati cooperation in encircling Saudi Arabia just broke all the any reservations the Saudis had any longer about acting decently in the face of Yemeni and Israeli aggressions. And basically the Saudis went max on the UAE, right? They went max on the UAE. They basically kicked the UAE out of, I sent this on WhatsApp to you. You can choose whichever of the maps. They went max on the UAE. They've tried to reverse all their gains, not just in Yemen, but in Sudan, throughout the Horn of Africa, in Somalia. You actually we'll have a piece on this on Friday, I think. Very, very deep dive into Ethiopia is now. So much happening, Danny. It's hard to keep up. But yeah. Ethiopia is now playing with the Emiratis and the Israelis, okay? To the chagrin of the Egyptians and other actors. I mean, there is hell breaking out there, but the Saudis are going in a way that we haven't seen them go in such a long time. They're a very conservative country in terms of foreign policy. We saw a little deviation from that when Mohammed bin Salman became the crown prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, right? Where he just was a wild 31-year-old doing everything his heart desired. But he pulled back from that. And for a couple years now, the Saudis have been steaming beneath the surface about the Emiratis. Okay? And now every single Arab country that could not make a peep about Israel because, the Americans will be mad at us, is going full force against the Emirates. Because of Israel's desire to work with the Emirates to basically, surround Saudi Arabia, to be able to trap them, if you will. Maybe even break up Saudi Arabia, maybe even kill Mohammed bin Salman. It's like, what wouldn't they do, right? But here's the thing. What this did was it brought all three existing alliances in the region, the resistance axis, the Qatari Turkey sort of Muslim Brotherhood alliance, and then the moderate Arab alliance, the Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf plus Egypt plus Jordan, brought them on the same side against the UAE. So instead of an Arab NATO, so you can see on this map, you can see that the Saudis have, they're so big, Saudi Arabia, that they're on the Persian Gulf and they're on the Red Sea, right? But if the Emiratis were able with the Israelis to get all the string of ports along from the Persian Gulf all the way through the south of Yemen and Oman, and then up through the Red Sea into Israel, right? Into Israel, not bypassing the Suez Canal, that the Saudis would just, lose a lot of power projection. And so a lot is changing. The Israelis are now afraid this backlash will bring Arabs more in line with the Iranians, and of course have made the Arabs, like a country like Saudi Arabia, basically lobby against a U.S. war against Iran. Qatar lobby against a U.S. war against Iran. Turkey lobby against a U.S. war in Iran, because now the interests have shifted in this region.